When she first met his family, there was an uneasy tension in the air that had nothing to do with shyness or formality. It was the kind of tension that settled in the pit of her stomach and made every smile feel like a test. They shook her hand, asked polite but clipped questions, and kept glancing at each other as if silently passing judgment. She had dressed carefully, spoken warmly, and approached them with genuine openness, but it became clear within minutes that her presence was not being measured on the usual scale of "do we like her?" It was something far deeper, sharper, and harder to change. Later, when her boyfriend pulled her aside, his voice was heavy. He told her the truth. His parents had already said, before even meeting her, that they didn't want a black daughter-in-law. They had made their stance clear, not through vague hints or polite hesitations, but through direct, unapologetic statements. They believed they were simply being honest about their preferences, as if love and marriage could be filtered like items on a shopping list. It wasn't about her as a person, they insisted, it was about what was best for the family, which was their coded way of saying they wanted someone who looked like them, someone who fit their image of what their son's life should be. That moment was more than an insult. It was a gate slamming shut before she even had the chance to knock. She hadn't even told them her story, her dreams, or her values. They hadn't asked about her background, her work, or the little things that made her laugh. Instead, they had made their decision using one fact, the color of her skin, and treated it as the only detail worth considering. There was a cold, matter-of-fact cruelty to it. No heated arguments. No loud disapproval. Just a firm wall of rejection that felt immovable. What made it worse was the way it lingered in every interaction afterward. She could feel it in the pauses before they responded to her, in the way they seemed to search for neutral topics, and in the moments when their eyes darted to each other before answering a question. Even their politeness had an edge to it, the kind that says, "We'll behave, but only because we have to." Every word she spoke seemed to be weighed and measured, not for its meaning, but for how well she could fit in despite not being what they wanted. Her boyfriend, caught between loyalty to her and loyalty to his family, tried to ease the tension, but he couldn't erase the fact that their rejection was rooted in something she could never change. She wasn't going to wake up one day with a different skin tone to satisfy them. She wasn't going to pretend to be someone else just to win approval that had been withheld before she even said hello. That reality sat heavily between them during every visit, like an invisible third party at the table. The first few times she visited, she tried to see the best in them. She brought small gifts, asked about their lives, and offered to help with cooking or cleaning up after meals. But it was clear her efforts were not enough to thaw the ice. The rejection had already hardened into a belief, and that belief was reinforced by years of unexamined prejudice. She realized that in their eyes, she was not just a person, she was a challenge to their sense of tradition, their comfort, and their image of themselves. There were moments when she wondered whether it was worth it, whether it made sense to keep showing up when the welcome was always lukewarm at best. Yet, walking away felt like letting them win, like letting their narrow view define her relationship. She was stubborn enough to believe that she could still live her life fully without shrinking herself to fit their mold, even if they never saw her the way she deserved to be seen. The prejudice was not just a personal insult. It was part of a larger, uglier truth about how some families still protect their sense of belonging by excluding anyone who doesn't match them in appearance or background. It was about control, the idea that they could dictate the terms of their son's happiness and the composition of their family tree. She was standing face to face with that control, and though she hadn't yet figured out how to dismantle it, she refused to bow to it. She knew she couldn't force them to accept her, and she wasn't naive enough to think that one kind gesture or one heartfelt conversation would erase years of ingrained bias. But she also knew that her worth was not defined by their approval. Even in those early days, when the sting of rejection was fresh, she carried herself with the quiet conviction that she belonged anywhere love had brought her. And if they couldn't see that yet, she would let time do the talking. Choosing love despite family opposition was never a decision she made lightly. It wasn't a whimsical act of rebellion or a romantic impulse born from the idea of us against the world. It was a choice she arrived at after countless moments of self-reflection, late-night conversations, and the quiet knowledge that real love doesn't come along every day. She knew from the beginning that this relationship wouldn't be the smooth, picture-perfect storybook version she might have once imagined. There would be tension at family gatherings, whispers behind closed doors, and moments when she would be reminded, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, that she was unwelcome in a space that should have embraced her. But when she looked at him, none of that outweighed the depth of their connection. They had built something rooted in honesty, respect, and mutual admiration. He wasn't just a partner who made her laugh and shared her dreams. He was someone who stood beside her in moments of uncertainty and who never made her feel less than. The bond between them had been tested early on by the harsh words of those closest to him, but instead of breaking under that pressure, it had grown stronger. In a way, their relationship had matured faster than most, because they had to confront challenges that many couples never face until years into marriage. Still, the choice to stay came with its own quiet cost. She had to prepare herself for the emotional labor of navigating his family's disapproval. There were days when the weight of it all felt heavy, when she questioned whether love was enough to bridge the gap between their private world and the public one that included his relatives. And yet, every time she thought about walking away, she found herself drawn back to the simple truth: he was worth it. He was worth the uncomfortable dinners, the guarded small talk, and the moments when she could feel the judgment in the room without a single word being spoken. He, for his part, never hid from the conflict. From the moment he realized his family's stance, he made it clear where he stood. He told her that their love was not negotiable, that his commitment was to her first, and that no amount of family pressure would change that. This unwavering loyalty didn't erase the pain, but it gave her the courage to keep moving forward. She knew she wasn't alone in the fight for their relationship. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, facing the same storm. There were times when his support came at a cost to him, too. He endured arguments, cold shoulders, and subtle guilt-tripping from the people who had raised him. He had to defend their relationship over and over, sometimes in the face of outright hostility, other times through the slow erosion of trust between him and those who couldn't accept his choice. But he never let that sway him. His actions told her every day that he saw her for who she was, not for the labels others tried to place on her. Their love began to operate in its own protected space, a kind of sanctuary where they could be themselves without fear of judgment. They built rituals and routines that were entirely their own, cooking together late at night, taking long walks where they could talk freely, and celebrating milestones in ways that reflected their shared values rather than the expectations of others. This private world became a refuge, a place where the noise of outside disapproval could not drown out the sound of their laughter or the warmth of their shared dreams. Friends and acquaintances sometimes asked her how she could endure the situation. They hinted, gently or otherwise, that maybe it would be easier to find someone whose family would embrace her without hesitation. But she knew that love was not about choosing the path of least resistance. It was about choosing the person who made the resistance worth enduring. She believed in the life they were building together, in the kindness and integrity that had drawn her to him in the first place. There was a quiet defiance in her choice, not the kind that sought to provoke or prove a point, but the kind that simply refused to let prejudice dictate the course of her life. By staying, she wasn't just choosing him, she was choosing herself, too. She was choosing to honor her own ability to decide who she would love and how she would live, without surrendering that decision to the narrow standards of others. It wasn't about winning anyone over in the moment. It was about committing to something real and trusting that time, consistency, and authenticity would eventually speak louder than the fears and biases that stood in their way. She understood that the road ahead would be long, filled with moments that tested her patience and resolve. But she also knew that in the quiet, everyday moments they shared, the ones untouched by family drama, their love felt uncomplicated, pure, and entirely worth the fight. Proving character through actions, not words, became her unspoken mission from the very beginning. She understood that no speech, no perfectly crafted explanation, and no heartfelt plea would change the way his family saw her overnight. People who held on to prejudices that tightly were not swayed by declarations, they were swayed, if at all, by time and the undeniable evidence of who someone truly was. So instead of trying to convince them directly, she focused on living in a way that left no room for doubt about her integrity, her kindness, and her commitment to their son. It started in small, almost invisible ways. When they visited his parents, she would arrive on time, bring something thoughtful, a dessert she had made from scratch, a bouquet from a local market, or a small gift that reflected something she remembered from a past conversation. She didn't do these things to win points, she did them because that was who she was. But she also knew that, in a world where people were quick to define her through stereotypes, every action she took was either reinforcing their biases or quietly dismantling them. She listened more than she spoke, not because she had nothing to say, but because she wanted them to feel heard. She asked about their lives, their work, their memories from years past. Even when their answers were curt or laced with subtle condescension, she didn't react with defensiveness. She met each moment with patience, reminding herself that character was revealed not in moments of comfort but in moments of tension. Over time, her actions extended beyond the walls of their home. When his sister fell ill unexpectedly, she offered to drop off meals, run errands, and even sit with her during doctor visits. When his father's business went through a rough patch, she quietly used her own contacts to help him find potential clients, never mentioning to anyone that she had played a role in the introductions. She didn't seek acknowledgement for these things. Her goal was not to hear them say thank you but to build a pattern of reliability that spoke for itself. She made a conscious choice never to speak poorly of them to others, even when she had every reason to. Friends would ask, with a knowing tone, how she managed to deal with the way his family treated her. She could have vented in detail, listing every slight and cold remark. Instead, she kept her words measured, not because she was blind to reality but because she refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her lose her composure. She understood that gossip and bitterness would only confirm the false narratives they might already believe about her. Her boyfriend noticed these efforts and was deeply moved by them, though he sometimes wished she didn't have to work so hard for acceptance. But she wasn't doing it to change herself or to mold her personality into something more palatable for them. She was simply allowing her natural character to be seen over time, trusting that consistency could chip away at even the most rigid walls. There were days when the progress felt non-existent. A polite smile here or a slightly warmer tone there didn't seem like much after years of resistance. But she kept showing up, kept offering help, and kept treating them with the same level of respect she expected in return. She knew that trust was built in layers, and that some people needed to see the same pattern repeated again and again before they began to believe it was genuine. It was during unexpected moments that her character shone most clearly. When a family gathering turned tense over an unrelated argument, she was the one who diffused the situation with calm reasoning. When plans fell apart last minute, she was the one who adjusted without complaint, pitching in to make things work. She didn't just talk about being dependable, she demonstrated it, often without anyone having to ask. Her consistency created a quiet contrast against the assumptions they had made about her. She didn't match the image they had in their heads of someone who would disrupt their family's unity or bring unnecessary drama. Instead, she became a steady presence, someone who could be counted on in both small inconveniences and genuine crises. Even if they didn't say it aloud, she knew they were beginning to notice. It wasn't that her actions erased the prejudice entirely, deeply ingrained biases rarely vanish so easily. But they made it harder for his family to cling to their initial judgments without confronting the evidence right in front of them. They could still hold on to their discomfort about her being different, but they could no longer honestly deny that she had proven herself to be trustworthy, compassionate, and committed to their son's happiness through every season of their lives together. The moments when the family needed help often came without warning, creeping into their lives in the form of emergencies, sudden illnesses, or unexpected crises that disrupted the usual rhythm of things. These were the times when pretenses fell away and what mattered most was who showed up, who stayed, and who could be counted on when everything felt uncertain. She had never set out to be their lifeline, but when those moments arrived, she didn't think about past insults or the years of coolness that had defined their relationship. She thought about what needed to be done, and she stepped in. The first real instance happened when his younger brother was involved in a car accident. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to leave him with injuries that required hospital visits, paperwork, and a lot of care in the weeks that followed. His parents were shaken and overwhelmed, unsure how to juggle their work schedules with the demands of their son's recovery. Without hesitation, she volunteered to drive him to appointments, coordinate with the doctors, and help manage the mountain of medical forms. She didn't frame it as a favor to them, she simply acted because it was the right thing to do. Later, when his mother was diagnosed with a health condition that required dietary changes and regular monitoring, she quietly began researching recipes and meal plans that would be both healthy and appealing. She would prepare dishes in her own kitchen, pack them neatly, and drop them off without lingering too long or expecting thanks. She knew that in the past, his mother had barely acknowledged her efforts, but in these moments of need, she wasn't thinking about acknowledgement. She was thinking about making things easier for someone who was struggling. There was also the day his father's car broke down unexpectedly on the side of the road. It was the middle of winter, bitterly cold, and he had been waiting for roadside assistance for hours without success. When her partner mentioned it, she grabbed her coat, drove out to where he was stranded, and stayed with him until the tow truck arrived. She didn't make a show of it, didn't bring up the history between them, and didn't even mention it later. For her, it was simply a matter of human decency. If someone was in trouble, you helped. In each of these situations, she could have stepped back and let someone else take responsibility. She could have justified keeping her distance by reminding herself of how they had treated her in the past. But every time, she made the same choice, to be present, to be useful, and to act without bitterness. She believed that character was revealed in the way a person behaved when there was nothing to gain, and she lived by that principle whether or not it was noticed. What stood out in these moments wasn't just her willingness to help, but her ability to stay calm and resourceful under pressure. When others were panicking or unsure of what to do, she was the one making phone calls, arranging schedules, and ensuring that the details were handled. She became the steady pair of hands in the middle of the storm, the person who could be relied upon to bring order to chaos. Over time, these acts of help began to form a pattern. His family might not have spoken openly about it, but they started to reach out more often when something went wrong. A forgotten errand, a last-minute childcare emergency, or a logistical mess that no one else had time to fix, somehow, her name would come up as the person who could take care of it. It was never framed as trust, at least not in words, but the unspoken acknowledgement was there. They called because they knew she would answer. Even when the calls came at inconvenient times, in the middle of her workday, late at night, or when she was already juggling her own commitments, she found a way to help if she could. She didn't say yes to everything, but when she did, she gave her full attention. She handled their needs with the same care she would offer her own family, not because she was trying to prove herself anymore, but because it was part of who she was. Through these moments of need, the dynamic between them began to shift in subtle ways. The sharp edges of their disapproval softened slightly, replaced by a grudging respect that grew each time she showed up without hesitation. They may not have been ready to admit how much they relied on her, but the truth was becoming harder for them to ignore. In times of crisis, it wasn't always their relatives, neighbors, or lifelong friends who stepped in first. It was the woman they had once insisted would never belong in their family, quietly standing in the gap when it mattered most, becoming the trusted, dependable one. Didn't happen through a single grand gesture but through a series of consistent actions that, over time, began to change how they saw her. In the beginning, trust was not something they were willing to extend. It was withheld like a privilege she hadn't earned and perhaps never would in their eyes. But as the months and years unfolded, she became the person they instinctively turned to when things needed to be done right. It was a shift that happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day it was simply the way things were. It wasn't just about showing up in emergencies. Dependability, she knew, was also measured in the everyday tasks, the quiet reliability that made people feel secure even when nothing dramatic was happening. She learned the rhythms of the family, who preferred certain foods, who disliked certain errands, who needed reminders for appointments, and who was most likely to forget important dates. Without being asked, she started filling in the gaps. She would pick up groceries when she knew someone was too busy to shop, drop off prescriptions before they ran out, and take on the behind-the-scenes work that kept things running smoothly. They might not have been quick to praise her, but they began to realize that when she said she would do something, it was as good as done. If she promised to be somewhere, she was there, on time, prepared, and ready to handle whatever came up. This reliability stood in stark contrast to the unpredictability of others they had leaned on in the past, and though they didn't say it aloud, they began to prefer her involvement. Her boyfriend noticed the shift before anyone else acknowledged it. He would see how his mother called her instead of him for certain matters, or how his father would consult her opinion on logistical decisions, not because they suddenly liked her more, but because they trusted her judgment. She had earned that trust not by demanding it, but by proving, over and over again, that she could be counted on. The real turning point came during a particularly stressful period when several family matters overlapped at once: an illness, a financial issue, and a household repair that couldn't wait. She stepped in to coordinate everything, managing schedules, making phone calls, and ensuring each problem was addressed without letting any of them fall through the cracks. It wasn't glamorous work, and most of it went unnoticed in the moment, but when the dust settled, they realized she had been the thread holding it all together. Even in less urgent situations, her dependability became an anchor. If there was a family event, she was the one who ensured the details were organized and nothing was forgotten. If someone needed help with a project, she offered her time without making it feel like a burden. She didn't overpromise, but she also didn't disappear when things became inconvenient. Her consistency spoke for itself. What made her dependability stand out was that it wasn't conditional. She didn't withhold her help when she felt slighted, nor did she make her assistants feel like a favor they owed her for. She gave it freely, without keeping a mental ledger, which made it easier for them to call on her without fear of judgment or resentment. In a family that had once kept her at arm's length, she became the one person they could approach without hesitation when they truly needed something done. Slowly, the balance shifted from her being the outsider to her being the one they trusted with important matters. They might still hold on to some of their old biases, but those biases began to exist alongside an undeniable truth: she had become indispensable in ways they hadn't expected. She was the safe pair of hands, the person who could step into a complicated situation and quietly bring order to it. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that she would follow through on her word. Even when other family members offered to help, they sometimes turned to her instead, knowing that she wouldn't leave things half-finished or forget about them. Her reliability became part of the family's unspoken infrastructure, woven into the way they operated, even if they never directly credited her for it. Her role as the dependable one didn't come with applause or constant gratitude, but she wasn't looking for that. What mattered to her was knowing that, despite the early resistance, they now saw her as someone they could rely on in ways they hadn't imagined when they first met her. The same people who had once doubted her place in the family now depended on her to help hold it together, and though they might never admit it outright, a conversation that lasted a little longer than usual, a genuine laugh shared over a small joke, an unsolicited update about someone's day. These moments were small but significant, each one loosening the grip of the prejudice that had once kept her at arm's length. It wasn't that the past had been erased or that their original stance had been forgotten. Those early words, their refusal to accept her because of her race, still lingered somewhere in the background. But over time, her steady presence, her patience, and her refusal to meet hostility with hostility had begun to chip away at the walls they had built around themselves. They had seen her in moments of strength and moments of vulnerability, in everyday life and in times of crisis, and their perception of her began to shift from an outsider to someone who belonged. One of the first signs of this change came when they began to include her in family decisions, even those that didn't directly involve her. It was subtle at first, a quick question about her opinion on a matter, a request for her input on an upcoming event. Later, it became more deliberate, with them seeking her advice on personal matters, trusting her judgment in ways they hadn't in the past. These moments were not simply about logistics, they were a recognition that her voice held value within their circle. The change also showed itself in how they interacted with her when her partner wasn't around. In the early days, they often spoke to her only through him, as if needing a buffer. Over the years, that pattern faded. They began calling her directly, sometimes just to check in, other times to ask for help or share news. It was in these one-on-one conversations that the relationships began to deepen, no longer relying on his presence as the bridge between them. She noticed, too, that the formality in their tone began to soften. Nicknames appeared where once there had only been her full name. Invitations to family events started arriving without the quiet hesitation she had once detected. And when she walked into a room, the smiles that greeted her no longer felt forced but carried a genuine warmth that had taken years to cultivate. It wasn't only their behavior toward her that changed, but her own feelings toward them. While she hadn't forgotten the way she had been treated in the beginning, she no longer felt the same heaviness in their presence. She could enter their home without bracing herself for subtle jabs or cold silences. The air between them had shifted, and though trust was still something she approached with caution, she allowed herself to enjoy the progress they had made. The transformation wasn't without setbacks. There were still moments when old attitudes resurfaced, when someone made a thoughtless comment or reacted from a place of outdated thinking. But she had learned to address those moments with calm and, when necessary, to let them pass without letting them define the whole relationship. She understood that change was rarely linear and that progress could coexist with imperfection. Over time, the family dynamic began to look markedly different from what it had been when she first entered their lives. There was more openness, more mutual respect, and a level of comfort that would have been unimaginable in the early days. She found herself being entrusted with tasks and responsibilities that spoke to their faith in her, and she noticed that they now introduced her to others with pride rather than hesitation. Perhaps the most telling sign of transformation was the way they spoke about her when she wasn't around. Friends of the family, mutual acquaintances, and even distant relatives would mention that they had heard how helpful she had been during a certain situation, or how highly someone had spoken of her. These second-hand remarks revealed a truth that they might never say directly to her. She had earned their respect, and they now saw her as an integral part of the family. This gradual evolution from rejection to reliance was not the result of a single turning point but 1,000 small moments that accumulated over years. Every time she showed up when it mattered, every time she offered kindness without expecting it in return, and every time she handled a difficult situation with grace, another piece of their resistance fell away. The woman they had once refused to accept had become someone they could not imagine the family functioning without, and the way they treated her reflected that undeniable reality.